The first time I saw her fall to the floor, her silver cup still shaking in her hand, I knew something inside that house was very wrong, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any scream. Her body was thin and weak, but her eyes were open wide, as if she wanted to say something but could not move her lips. I am Emma Carter. I am 28 years old, and I work as a private nurse in Chicago. I grew up in a small apartment with my mother, and I studied hard because I wanted a better life and a job where I could help people who could not help themselves. When the agency told me about a rich family who needed full-time care for their elderly mother, I thought it was a lucky chance because the salary was high and the house was a large mansion near the lake, with white walls and tall windows that looked peaceful from outside. The old woman's name was Margaret Wilson. She was 76 years old, and she once owned many hotels with her late husband. But after he died, she became sick and slowly lost her memory. Sometimes she remembered her children, and sometimes she looked at them like strangers. Her son David and her daughter Lisa lived in the mansion with her. They dressed in expensive clothes and smiled politely at me on my first day. But their smiles felt cold, like they were only acting for a camera. "Take good care of our mother," David told me, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. "She forgets things, she gets confused, so do not listen if she says strange stories." I nodded, because I was new there, and I needed the job. At first, everything seemed normal. I gave Mrs. Margaret her medicine, helped her walk slowly in the garden, and read to her in the afternoon, while the house stayed quiet, too quiet for such a big place. Sometimes she held my hand tightly and whispered, "Emma, do you trust my children?" I did not know what to say, so I smiled gently and told her to rest. One evening, while I was cleaning her room, I noticed a small bottle on the table near her bed. It was not part of the medicine I gave her, and the label was missing. When I asked Lisa about it, she looked surprised for a second. Then she laughed softly and said, "Oh, that is just vitamins. The doctor suggested it, but I never saw any doctor bring those pills." A few days later, Mrs. Margaret became weaker. Her hands shook more, and she could not finish her soup. Her skin looked pale, and she often felt dizzy after drinking from her silver cup, the same cup she always used at dinner. That night, she suddenly fell from her chair. The cup rolled across the floor, and I rushed to hold her, while David stood near the door, watching us without moving. "Call the ambulance," I shouted, but he calmly said, "No, she just needs rest." "It happens all the time." His voice was too steady, too prepared. When I helped her back to bed, she opened her eyes slowly and whispered, "They are waiting for me to die." Her words stayed in my mind long after she fell asleep, and I began to watch the family more carefully, noticing how they exchanged silent looks at dinner, how they insisted on giving her certain drinks themselves, and how they talked about lawyers in low voices when they thought I was not near. One afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen, I heard David say, "The will is clear. Once she is gone, everything is ours." Lisa answered in a soft but excited tone, "Then we just need patience." My heart beat faster. Because patience for what? For their own mother to die. From that day, I stopped trusting their smiles, and I started counting every pill, watching every drink, and listening to every whisper in that large, beautiful house that felt more like a quiet prison. I did not yet know the full truth, but I felt it coming closer, like a dark shadow moving slowly across the white walls of the mansion. After that night, I stopped believing this was only sickness, and I began to see a pattern in every small action inside the mansion, where kindness was shown in public, but fear moved quietly behind closed doors. Mrs. Margaret's condition became worse each week. Her hands trembled more, her steps grew shorter, and she often looked at me with clear eyes in the morning, then confused eyes at night. as if her mind was fighting a hidden battle inside her. One afternoon, while I was helping her change clothes, she suddenly held my wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Emma, they think I do not remember, but I remember more each day." Her voice was weak, her words were sharp, and I felt a chill move down my back. That same evening, I heard David arguing on the phone in his office, his voice low but angry. "I told you I will have the money soon, just give me more time." I stood outside the door, frozen, because his words did not sound like a son waiting with love. They sounded like a man trapped by debt. Later, I saw Lisa sitting alone at the dining table, staring at a stock of unpaid bills, her perfect makeup hiding nothing from her tired eyes. When she noticed me, she quickly covered the papers and forced a smile, but her hands were shaking. Slowly, the truth became clearer. They were not only greedy, they were desperate, drowning in loans and afraid of losing everything, and their mother's long life felt like a wall standing between them and their freedom. One morning, Mrs. Margaret looked at me and said softly, "They asked the lawyer to come next week." My heart stopped for a second. "Why?" I asked carefully. She closed her eyes and answered, "Because I told them I want to change my will." The room felt suddenly smaller. She explained in broken sentences that she wanted to give part of her money to a children's hospital in Chicago, because her husband once promised to help sick children. And she also wanted to leave something for me, because I was the only one who stayed beside her bed when she cried at night. I told her she should rest, but inside I understood everything. If she changed the will, David and Lisa would lose millions, and maybe even the mansion. 2 days later, her health became dangerously worse. She could not stand without falling, and after every meal prepared by Lisa, she felt strong pain in her stomach. I began to check her food carefully, and one evening I saw Lisa pour something clear from a small bottle into the silver cup before bringing it to her mother. When Lisa saw me watching, her face turned pale. "It is just medicine," she said quickly. "Then why do you not let me give it?" I asked. She did not answer. That night, Mrs. Margaret did not sleep. She looked at me with full awareness, as if the fog in her mind had finally lifted. "Emma," she said slowly, "they are poisoning me." The word felt heavy in the air. I wanted to deny it, but I could no longer lie to myself. She asked me to bring her a pen and paper, and with shaking hands she began to write, stopping often to breathe, but her eyes stayed focused and clear. "I must write before they stop me," she whispered. I stood near the door, listening for footsteps, my heart beating fast, because if they entered and saw what she was writing, I did not know what they would do. She finished the letter after almost an hour, folded it carefully, and placed it in my hand. "If anything happens to me," she said, her voice breaking, "promise me you will give this to the police." I looked at the envelope, feeling its weight, knowing it carried more than paper. It carried truth, danger, and a choice that could destroy everything. Before I could answer, we heard steps in the hallway, slow and steady, coming closer to her bedroom door. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and for a long second the handle did not move, as if someone was listening to our breathing from the other side. I quickly hid the envelope inside my uniform pocket, pressing it close to my heart, while Mrs. Wilson closed her eyes and pretended to sleep. David entered first, his face calm, Lisa behind him with the silver cup in her hand. "She needs her drink," Lisa said softly, but her eyes were watching me, not her mother. I forced myself to stay steady and replied, "She already took her medicine." David stepped closer to the bed and looked down at Mrs. Wilson, then at me, and for a moment I felt he could see the letter through my clothes. "You look tired, Emma," he said in a slow voice. "Maybe you should rest tonight. We can take care of her." "I am fine," I answered, though my hands were cold. They stood there a few seconds longer, then finally left the room, closing the door quietly. But the silence they left behind was louder than any noise. Mrs. Margaret opened her eyes again and whispered, "You must go tomorrow, before they know." I nodded, even though fear was growing inside me, because I understood that once I walked out with that letter, I would not be safe. The next morning, the sky was gray over Chicago, and the mansion felt colder than usual, as if the walls knew what was about to happen. I helped Mrs. Margaret eat a little breakfast, but she was very weak. Her hands could barely hold the spoon. She looked at me with deep understanding and said, "Thank you for believing me." I wanted to promise her that everything would be fine, but I could not lie. Around noon, David told me he needed to drive to the bank, and Lisa said she had a meeting, and for the first time in weeks, the house became empty except for me and the old woman lying quietly in her bed. This was my chance. I told Mrs. Margaret I would return soon, and she squeezed my fingers gently, her eyes shining with both fear and hope. I walked out of the mansion trying to look normal, but every step felt heavy, and I kept expecting someone to call my name from behind. When I reached the gate, I heard a car engine start inside the garage. My heart jumped. David's car came out fast, stopping in front of me. He lowered the window and looked at me with a small smile. "Going somewhere, Emma?" he asked. "I just need fresh air," I replied, trying to breathe normally. He stared at me for a moment that felt endless, then drove away without another word. I did not wait. I ran to the bus stop at the corner, my hand holding the envelope tightly inside my pocket. Every passing car made me nervous. Every stranger's face looked like a threat. But I kept moving, because Mrs. Margaret's weak voice was still in my ears. When I finally reached the police station, my legs were shaking. I walked inside and told the officer at the desk, "I have proof that someone is trying to kill their mother." My voice broke, but I gave him the letter. He read it slowly, his face changing from doubt to shock, and he immediately called other officers to follow him. They told me to stay there for my safety. Hours passed, like years. Then the phone at the station rang. One officer answered, listened quietly, then looked at me with eyes I will never forget. "There was an accident at the Margaret mansion," he said softly. "The old woman passed away this afternoon." The world around me became silent. They told me she had suddenly stopped breathing before the police arrived, and the doctors could not save her. I felt something break inside my chest, because I had left her alone for just a short time, and that time was enough. Later the investigation began. The letter became evidence, and tests showed poison in her body. Slow and hidden for months, David and Lisa were arrested, their faces pale as they were taken away from the same house they were so afraid to lose. But justice did not feel like victory. Mrs. Margaret Wilson was gone. Her life ended not by illness, but by the hands of her own children. At her funeral, the mansion stood silent behind us, large and beautiful, but empty of warmth. I stood near her grave, with tears falling freely, remembering how she held my hand and trusted me when no one else did. She had money, power, and a big family name, yet in the end, she only had one nurse beside her bed, fighting for her truth. Sometimes at night I still hear her whisper, "Do you trust my children?" And I wish I had come sooner, acted faster, saved her before it was too late. The letter exposed their silent crime, but it could not bring her back. In that grand mansion by the lake, the walls still stand tall, but the silence inside them now carries a story of greed, betrayal, and a mother who died waiting for love that never came. If you were in my place, would you risk everything to tell the truth, or would fear stop you? Tell me in the comments. I truly want to know what you would have done.